Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm just doing MC work here, meaning I'm just going to introduce everybody, get out of the way. So just want to tell you a little bit about Daniel, who's been a really amazing colleague for me for many years now. He's at Arizona State University, where I was until about 7 months ago. He's, as you can see, he's the director of the Control Systems Engineering Lab there. He's in the School of Engineering. And in my mind, Daniel is just one of a true, wonderful, rare bird. Someone who is just really interested in figuring out how to apply his methods in a novel domain. I mean, I feel like he really espouses transdisciplinarity of, I saw him give a talk first at Society of Behavioral Medicine, and at that time I was really just struggling with this question of how the heck can we handle behavior change? I just feel like our methods don't come anywhere close to matching the complexity of this. And when I saw Daniel give his talk at SBM, coming into a behavioral science world as a control systems engineer who has training in chemical engineering and whatnot, it was, wow, that actually is a method that could really make sense for this. And I just think he's an amazing colleague and friend, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he tells you guys about. So, Daniel, come on up.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, for the very kind introduction. And it has been 7 months since you left. I'm still trying to work through it. But again, our collaboration continues. In fact, many of the things that there will be a lot of things that I will talk about that will be related. Will actually be things that Eric and his group spearheaded. So any hard questions that come relating to that, he can answer. I'm glad that he's here to do that. By the way, it's a great honor to be part of this training institute, and I had heard about it before. I had seen some of the videos from prior years, and when I received the invitation, it was, an honor, but also a great responsibility. So I'm going to try to do my best to make these 45 minutes worthwhile for all of us. I know that we have a very diverse audience, and hopefully there'll be something here that will resonate with everyone in the room. Now, what I'm going to do is, as I hear my talk, is translating behavior change theories into models for adaptive mHealth interventions. And I'll start out by giving some perspective, some broad-based perspective of where I'm coming from in terms of this topic as an engineer, working in the control systems area. In fact, my very first job after I got my Ph.D. was I worked for almost 4 years for Shell Development Company in petrochemical related issues back in the late 80s. Okay, and after that general perspective, I will illustrate some of my points with 3 problems that we worked on over the years. One relates to smoking cessation, where we use principles of self-regulation. Bonnie spoke about those before. We have an ongoing project on gestational weighting, which is a very specialized kind of weight control problem. And here I will illustrate how we've used the theory of planned behavior. And then the work with actually not just Eric, but others who are in the room. Bill Riley was one of the individuals who got us involved in this initially. Relates to social cognitive theory, a dynamical systems model. And then there's an intervention that we have developed called Just Walk. And then I'll try to wrap things up. Okay. Now, in my talk, I will attempt to build on some of the ideas and concepts that were shared in the 3 excellent talks we had this morning. By the way, I realize that this is I'm the first engineering speaker, and I'm also the first after lunch speaker. So keep that in mind. So, and what I want to show you is how I look at taking behavioral theory and translating it into useful models that can be part of adaptive time varying mHealth interventions using what's called control systems engineering. Now, a couple caveats. I'm an engineer, okay, and I say this because engineering sensibilities will be clear in what I share with you. oftentimes we get lumped, the engineers and computer scientists, as one entity. And then they'll also, Eric and I laugh a little bit about this, but do your magic, go on, that's sort of like the tendency, go on and do your magic. And we draw from we have overlap, but we draw from different pools of magic. Okay, so hopefully after I'm done, you'll get a sense that, hey, maybe I might lead an engineering project, and as well as some computer scientists, because this was brought up. I mean, I think that you did a great job in terms of justifying how you meet a whole bunch of folks and how we worship silos, so we should be breaking them. Okay. The other point, and this is something that Donna mentioned a couple of times, is a lot of things that I'm going to be saying are a starting point. You got to start somewhere. Okay. And then you build on up. And you will see that one of the philosophies that will be underlying some of the things I refer to is that we like to try the simplest thing first. Even if it may not seem that simple, you'll look at it and say, well, that doesn't look that simple. But if in our minds, it's like, we'll try the simplest thing and then work up our way in complexity. Now, as I go through and talk, it turns out that we've written a fair number of papers over the years, some that come out recently that I think would be very helpful. These papers capture a lot of what I'm going to say, maybe not necessarily in the same order in which I'm saying it. The first one I just mentioned is when I got started in working in behavioral health, behavioral medicine, my first journal paper was in drug and alcohol dependence in a special issue on adaptive treatment strategies. I was with Linda Collins. And I mention it because I don't know, when I was an undergraduate, I never imagined that I would publish in drug and alcohol dependence. But I wasn't opposed to it. I just never imagined that would be something that would happen. Okay, and that laid out some of the early ideas. The other papers that I'll mention is there are two papers in translational behavioral medicine. Actually, Bill Riley and I, while Bonnie was editor-in-chief, we co-edited a special issue on optimizing behavioral interventions. So even though this particular paper is focused on fibromyalgia, it does bring up a lot of concepts I'll be talking about. And then we also have a paper in TDM that lays out the dynamical systems model for social cognitive theory. We have a chapter in a book that was spearheaded by MD2K, and that if you have a good Springer Link subscription in your institution, you can download and access that. And then Eric spearheaded an excellent paper, Tutorial on Control Systems Engineering to Optimize Adaptive Mobile Health Interventions. It just came out in JMIR, and just within the last month. Yeah. And I'm sorry? Yes, and then last but not least, we have a chapter in the second volume of an edited series by Linda Collins and Carrie Kukler, and that's just impressive. That will actually be available in September. Okay? Yeah, not September yet, but very soon. And as I said earlier, a Springer Link subscription might give you access to that for free. Okay. So when I speak about control systems engineering, this is a very broadly applicable field. It's featured in many areas of engineering and science. And what we're looking at is we use dynamical systems models to develop algorithms that allow us to take behavior from undesirable conditions to desirable. That's basically the idea. And I'm not going to be spending so much time on talking about the mechanisms of control and how controllers are built and that kind of thing, because I really want to focus on how to use behavioral theory to get dynamical models. But overall, we're transferring variability. That's the idea, from somewhere where it creates a lot of problems to some resource in the system that is a lot more adjustable. And you see this technology in automobiles and cruise control, home heating and cooling, the artificial pancreas. Again, it's very ubiquitous, and this site from the IEEE Control Systems Society has a lot of success stories. You've interacted with control systems in some way in your life. I mean, it's often called the hidden technology because it's an important part of many things, but it doesn't get a lot of prominent attention. Now, in building a control system, we're interested in getting a model of the open loop system. Now, this diagram that I have here, I call it a block diagram. It's a signals and systems diagram. And the idea is to try to relate input and output variables. And P is basically just a generic representation of a system. It's going to be a system of equations. Okay, so we're interested in some output variables, which will be outcomes of interest. It could be either proximal or distal. We have manipulated variables, which are, and I have here some examples, whether how much steps are walked or how much weight gain or loss. Then we have manipulated variables, which are things that can be adjusted experimentally or in some way by the user, and this could involve some kind of goals, meal demonstrations, particular dosages of medication, and the like. And then the second kind of input would be what we call disturbance variables, and these are exogenous variables that affect the outcome but cannot be directly manipulated. And hopefully you can, as I mentioned here, busyness, stress, weather, etc. So if you can't manipulate them, at least hopefully you can measure them. And it's not always going to be possible to measure all disturbances, but you certainly want to understand the nature of disturbances affecting your system. Now, there's different, ways in which you get dynamical models in engineering, and in fact, when we teach the students, we teach them a lot of first principles type of modeling, going back to fundamentals of chemistry and physics to come up with models. But in practice, system identification is the approach that is used to getting these models empirically from data. Okay, and basically the idea behind system identification is that you can again create some sensible experiment that generates informative data, and you can do that in the presence of these disturbance inputs. The term actually comes from Lotfi Sadeh, who's the developer of fuzzy logic. He was a professor at UC Berkeley, and in many circumstances of industrial relevance. Like when I worked at Shell, that's how we got models, and you do these things, whether the system be a human being or a piece of equipment. I know that in the time that I was at Shell, we never turned off equipment to do tests. Okay, it was all superimposed on operations. So many of the practical requirements that are relevant in terms of human subjects were also relevant to us and the things that we did. We had to keep things short and sweet, and not create too much off-spec product, and leave things the way we found them, right, after we were done. Now, here are a few lessons that system identification teaches us, okay, that I would like to share with you. And sometimes these things don't get said, and they're not necessarily understood by folks, but you are going to hear these from me today. Well, first of all, system identification teaches you, see, in general, system identification is concerned with under what conditions is a fit to data going to result in a useful model. And we talked about that in our group, team group, that just because you fit to data well does not mean that you have a useful model, okay? So the value of having good experimental design, and this can include things like creating changes in inputs that create change, being able to collect validation data. The other is the importance and usefulness of having a priori knowledge. Okay, so whatever you know about your problem and can incorporate it into your modeling is going to be extremely important. And then, what I just alluded to, that just because you collect a lot of data and have a ton of data does not mean that it's going to be informative. Okay, and I think the big pitfall is that you could have an unmeasured disturbance that's correlated with your output, and you can fit well to the data you have, but this unmeasured effect is really messing things up to not allow you to get an informative model. And we can talk about that in more detail later if you have questions about that. The other one is don't estimate what you already know. Okay, so here I have as an example Newton's second law. I mean, if you know that F is equal to ma, there's no need to create an experiment to learn that again. And again, this just ties into the usefulness of a priori knowledge. And then last but not least, is that the intended purpose of the model is going to impact into model adequacy. So whether you're using your model for simulation, for designing a decision policy, that kind of thing, that's going to influence model accuracy requirements. And, okay, so keep these in mind because I will tap into some of these ideas as I go along. Now, my first example is based on some work we did a number of years ago with, we had an R21 with Linda Collins that involved us working with a group at the University of Wisconsin Center for Tobacco Research and Intervention. And this is a secondary data analysis. It's actually a pretty old data set that was done with PDAs and the like. And you had 4 groups that were either given drug or placebo. I guess the drug being bupropion SR. And then there were and then they could have counseling. So there were these 4 treatment groups. And here I'm going to focus on 2 of the treatment groups, and these are just averaged results from the treatment groups. And part of the reason was there was a lot of missing data and that kind of thing, and we wanted to see to what extent having the intensive data and seeing the dynamics would help us. So when you look at these 2 treatment groups, you have the quit date. You can see that folks quit, and then on average, then there's more resumption from the placebo group than the active group. But what I want you to focus on is the craving, okay? And as a dynamical systems person, when I see, for instance, here, you can see that there's sort of like a baseline of craving, there's an increase in craving, then followed by an ultimate decrease. So yes, the drug is better than placebo in terms of reducing craving, but this initial phenomenon here, we call inverse response. Okay, and in fact, the fact that the craving will increase after quit is going to have a lot of effect in terms of how you're, whether people relapse or not. Again, now these are average results, and Kevin Timms was a doctoral student, former doctoral student that worked on this. I asked him, can you pick 2 participants that had pretty good data with, so this is 2 representative participants, one that quit, and then one that had the drug, and then one that had the placebo, and you can see that the placebo person returned back. And in both cases, there's the inverse response. Now, again, I'm coming at this as a dynamical systems person and engineer, and I'm looking at this, and I know that this inverse response, the fact that the initial direction of the response is an opposite sign to the actual final magnitude, okay, represents the fact that I have 2 processes in parallel which are in competition. So just by looking at the data, just by looking at the intensive data here, I'm going to want to understand. I'm going to be naturally inclined to want to know, well, what's those 2 things that are going on, okay, and to what extent people can explain that to me, okay. So that, again, there's the S represents the plus transference, whatever. Just don't worry about that detail. But the idea is that you have these 2 parallel additive processes that they're sort of working against each other. The other phenomenon is Bonnie spoke about self-regulation of behavior. In fact, she even brought up this diagram. This is a great book, and it's got a lot of illustrations and a lot of interesting figures. It does not have a single equation, which is something that I find pretty remarkable, but nonetheless very useful. And and Bonnie spoke about self-regulation as being a behavioral theory. See, the way and I don't know, Bonnie can tell me if I'm wrong in looking at it, anytime you're able to measure something, that's going to trigger a self-regulation mechanism in folks, right? So if you're stepping on the scale and you can see your weight, you're going to do something about it. If you're getting a sense for how much you're eating or something, that's going to trigger. So this, to me as an engineer, is useful. Okay, and this is more of an older way of writing things. This is a feedback system. So what we did in doing this work on smoking cessation is that ultimately our model for smoking cessation uses the self-regulation along with this inverse response phenomenon. And that's what we postulated as a structure for understanding this data. And Kevin Timms, in papers that he's written as well as his dissertation, sort of did it was, again, secondary analysis and some reverse engineering. But, there's, again, the theory helped us come up with a reasonable model for trying to understand this data. We did the cohorts, and then we also did some individual participants. And our aspirational goal is then to take this model here, which is our open loop model, and then actually be able to do a feedback system with an adaptive intervention that makes decisions on all the different intervention components and measure some of the disturbances. We're not here yet because we haven't been involved in a study that's sort of geared towards validating this model, but we're certainly open to it. Again, so but I will lay that out as a first example, again, of how behavioral theory allowed us to come up with a dynamical model for the system. Okay. Now my second illustration comes from the problem with gestational weight gain. This is a project that we've been involved with Penn State University. There's a lot of good reasons to try to keep gestational weight gain within limits, particularly for obese and overweight women. And at Penn State, we're part of an R01, an NHLBI. Daniel Simmons Downs is the lead, is a PI, and the activity is called the Healthy Mom Zone. And there's all, a fair number of intervention components and measurements, and the idea is to come up with an adaptive time-varying intervention using control engineering. Okay. Now there's two phases to the study. There's a phase 1 and a phase 2. The phase 2 is longer and involves also some decision rules. Again, there's activity that's being monitored. We actually have papers written on correcting MyFitnessPal reports using energy balance, the RMRs, or estimated by correlation. In the phase 2, we actually use a breathing device. Now, this is the model structure for representing this adaptive intervention. Here we have an energy balance that is mechanistic, and then the behavioral aspect of these interventions is represented through the theory of planned behavior, one for physical activity and then one for energy intake. And then because there is measurement involved, we throw in some self-regulation. Okay. Now, just broadly about the theory of planned behavior, it's, I don't know how to properly say it, Ashton, okay, and it's just a theory that is popular within certain communities. And for us, the appealing aspect of the TPB, again, the persons that we worked with told us to work with this, is the fact that it has a path diagram, okay, that comes from structural equation modeling. Okay, and from this path diagram, we could get a so-called fluid analogy. Now, Donna spoke a little bit, or gave me a little bit of introduction there. Now, see here, this theory, you could argue, is static in its presentation. However, it has very valuable a priori information in terms of the interconnections between constructs. Okay, so as I was looking at these, a number of years ago, I realized, well, how can I take this information and generalize this into a dynamical system form? Okay, because these interconnections are useful. And what we basically recognized is that we could take each one of these constructs and represent these as inventories that are either increasing or depleting based on their interaction. You could look at it as essentially a flows of fluid where these tanks are either increasing or decreasing in their level based on the actions that are done exogenously. In this case, these beliefs and evaluations are the ones that drive this thing. Okay, so we can take and to do the modeling here, we just do some very basic chemical engineering, which is just accounting. We just keep track of right now I'm just focusing on the attitude inventory. So you keep track of what's coming in, and then keep track of what's coming out. The difference is what accumulates. So, without going into too much detail, the right-hand side of our equation is determined by the path diagram. The left-hand side dictates the dynamics and the type of shape of response that we expect to get. And we can, for the simplest form, we can get these so-called overdamped responses. Eric is an expert on all this stuff. Thankfully, after he can speak to you about this stuff. But hey, what if you're, and what we do to get a system of equations is we just write a balance for each one, and that's how we get the system of equations. For again, the right-hand side comes from the path diagram, the left-hand side comes from the type of response that we expect to get. Okay, and if we want it to be more complicated, we just put in a little self-regulator here, and now we get a second-order differential equation. And the nice thing about the second-order differential equation is it lets us capture a more general type of responses, inverse responses, oscillations, etc. Okay. So in working with different teams over the years, when we talk to them, the first time, when we initiate a collaboration, I said, "Do you have a path diagram? And can you tell us, is there any path diagram that we can use to try to get these things going?" And then we try the simplest type of response based on the phenomenon that they're dealing with. Okay. Here I just put this, if you like mediation, hey, we have a fluid analogy for that, right? Because it has a path diagram. And it's the same kind of idea, the left and the right, with the path diagram defining what's on the right, and then the left defining the shape of the dynamics. Now, for our problem that I showed earlier, this is just, the energy balance for weight, it's just, it's also tanks in terms of two inventories, fat mass, fat-free mass. Here's for our TPV diagram. There's some self-regulation, and then we keep track of, if you're delivering intervention components, these accumulate and deplete. So, who says there's no physics in behavioral interventions? There's a fair amount of structure here that we're taking advantage of from the knowledge of the theory. Now, one thing that I want to make clear, because this may seem like, oh wow, this may look complicated, but not every construct is going to be important, and I think Donna, you alluded to that as well. So this is for one of our phase 1 participants. The collaborators were happy with this simplified diagram. I think that's part of the process of discovery, is to get a sense for which ones of the constructs are important and should be measured, and coming up with parsimonious models. Okay, so far so good, right? And as I said, I'm going a little fast. We got the papers. I'm here for the rest of the week, and we have a number of folks that have that are from the behavioral side that have incorporated these ideas. So let me now go to my final example, which is how we came about with the dynamical model for social cognitive theory. And social cognitive theory comes from Bandura. And I have some background information here. I don't want to say too much about what it is, but it's an important theory of health behavior. And the way in which this fluid analogy, this is actually a very interesting problem, because Bill Riley brought up the need to do something like this, and then Eric was getting started at ASU, and then there were other folks at ASU, Matt Booman, Mark Adams, Misha Pablo, Ari King, that are elsewhere were also involved, my student, Cesar Martin, and this was conceived by people who had bought into the fluid analogy, so there's no path diagram associated with this. No path diagram was used to come up with this. These were now folks who sort of knew what the general idea of the fluid analogy was, and tried, and again, there were a lot of meetings and discussions, and this represents one postulation of the theory that we're trying to validate. Now, there is a path diagram for it now. I think that Bill and I were talking during lunch. There was some very simplified path diagram that was in one of Bandura's papers. But as a result of doing this fluid analogy exercise, where you have, I guess, there's operant learning, there's self-efficacy loop, there's basically 3-4 outcome expectancy, 4 different things of behaviors being affected by cues to action. Okay, so as a result of coming up with this fluid analogy, there is a path diagram that is in the TDM paper. But that was an afterthought of the model, not a. And the same exercise that I mentioned before. We take each one of these inventories, which is increasing or depleting based on the exogenous inputs, some which can be manipulated, some that cannot. You come up with a system of equations. And not necessarily every variable is important. Again, the right-hand side is determined by static considerations, the left-hand side by dynamic transient type effects. Now, the Just Walk intervention, which was funded by the NSF Smart Connected Health and was a collaboration of Eric and myself, came as had a number of objectives. And one of them was to try to validate this model. And in fact, that is one of our ongoing activities, is to validate this SET model. And it's sort of interesting because we've been finding interest in this model, even though it's built for health behavior. People are writing papers on using this model for human-robot interaction, for human interaction with air conditioning, building air conditioning systems, and that kind of thing. So I think I shared this yesterday with our group, that if your robot is friendly to you, it could be because of this model in the future, and it's had appeal in that regard. And so this intervention has 22 individuals, middle age, try to increase physical activity. And this was an idiographic type design. I know that, Eric, you have a talk on N1 science and the values involved in that. And yeah, the general idea here is that, you have the human behavior represented by this dynamical model. We have daily goals for walking, and points that participants get if they meet their goal. If they have so many points, they get an Amazon gift card. Okay, so that's why you have here this if-then, that if based on granted points is only if they meet the goal, that becomes then another input. So these two inputs we can experimentally manipulate, and then of course there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can measure. So the experimental design done here is by using so-called zippered multi-sign inputs. Now, the reason why they're zippered has to do with the frequency domain, okay? But these are essentially they're pseudo-random because they're deterministic, but they look random to folks. And one involves a set of goals, the other involves the available reinforcement. And this is probably the first, to our knowledge, the first ever system ID test done in a behavioral setting. And so 16-week cycles done for each one of these participants. The app was developed by Eric's technology group, the Just app, so you can see sort of what your target is and how many steps and then how many rewards you get. And then there's different EMA questions and things like that get asked. And then there's a number of variables that are measured in addition to the behavior, which is tracked by a Fitbit, right? Okay. So now, I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but we did a fair amount of black box modeling on this data, and we can do a lot of good stuff with black box methods. I only have the slide here because when I talk about the so-called ARX model, what it is, it's a lagged regression model, and we have good data, we can do good system identification practice, and we were able to get a lot of insights from the black box models, okay? So we would add the particularly important inputs, the goals, expected point, granted points, we would get a fit, we compare, then when we see we could add additional inputs based on things like busyness, stress, weekend, whether it's a weekday or weekend, and that's great. Okay, there's papers again there in the chapters that I mentioned that we talked about this. However, our interest is, can we validate this SEP model? That's our holy grail. Okay, that's what we're aiming towards. And this here is just one illustration of data for one participant. And this is the behavior here. You see, there's this fit index that I will be citing. I want to go to it. It's sort of like a percent variance fit. It's not exactly that, but it goes from minus infinity to 100%. Okay, and you can see that for this particular participant, a black box model gives about a 45% fit, which is pretty good. And then we have very clever ways of doing the estimation and validation to make sure that we weren't focusing on one particular time period. Okay, this modeling approach also allowed us to look into idiosyncrasy and be able to determine, are some folks stress affected in their exercise, positively or negatively? Are they do they do more exercise on the weekends or weekdays? Are they principally goal driven? Okay, so again, a lot of nice insights from the black box modeling. Now, in our semi-physical efforts, what we've been focusing on, and this is very, very recent work, on a subset of the SET model that involves the operant learning and the self-efficacy. So here these are the experimentally designed goals and expected points. Okay, this is the granted points, which is you get if you meet the goals. That's a behavioral outcome. Then you have the environmental context, which can involve weather, weekday, busyness, stress, etc. And this will be different for every individual. And then the goal attainment, which is part of the self-efficacy, is the difference between what the behavior that was given in the goal versus what was achieved. And part of the model, by the way, in the more expanded version of this paper, is that we can use the model to estimate achievable but ambitious but doable goals. Okay. Now, what I want to point out to you, and I think the important part to see, is I have 3 representative participants, and on top is the semi-physical fit, and below is a nice black box method. And with this parsimonious model, we're actually getting pretty good agreement. I mean, the fit indices are a little lower. In this case, it's just 1%. In this case, it's 4%. But look at how, in this one in particular, you can see how the pattern is being followed. One thing we do in identification is we never validate a model based on just one criterion. I tell that to my students all the time. So this one is 38 versus 34. And then this one is, this one's a bigger difference, 36 versus 26, but you can still see how the models agree. So here, again, we are able, or we can see the promise of being able to have a physical model based on theory that can apply to hopefully a whole bunch of participants. Okay? And that can inform experimental design, intervention development. And we're just getting started. So, so in summary for that aspect is that, we do have, some of our challenges have been measurement challenges. And in fact, I would, having been in the, industry and then been an academic for now 28 years, this class of problems in behavioral medicine, mHealth, creates, I think, the biggest challenges in terms of the interplay between measurement, design, and parameter estimation, more than any other problem I've seen. I mean, if I'm just working with a traditional chemical engineering problem, it's a whole bunch of thermocouples, I'm not so worried about them, okay? But here there's an interplay that is important, and we, again, in future work that we are, have being evaluated in proposals and the like, we're going to address that. Let me see, how am I doing time-wise? Okay, good deal. Okay, so far, see, my focus has been on being able to tap into aspects of theory, behavioral theory, to get these dynamical models. I really haven't said that much about the decision framework. Bonnie did a great job in she talked about the smart design, she talked about the JEDI. Our focus is mostly on controllers that are operating on a daily basis, okay, and we use what's called model predictive control as our decision framework, okay, and it basically it's a real-time optimization using quadratic programming, and it's very manageable. Again, it's been used in industry for a long time, and it doesn't require a supercomputer or the like. It could be done on a phone if necessary, or just with appropriate servers. And that's our we have a lot of results in simulation, but that's ultimately the goal. Again, we have our model, and then we have this decision algorithm that's using now the disturbances as an input, as well as then the things that can be manipulated. This picture here is, I wish I could claim these girls as my own and say they're my daughters. They're the daughters of Cesar Martin, who was my doctoral student, and he had this diagram from his district. So it's called hybrid predictive control. A hybrid is for reasons related to the variables. But the key thing about this decision algorithm is that it uses as an important component dynamical systems behavioral model. Okay, and again, our plans are to be able to validate this experimentally. This is just one simulation result where an individual goes from a certain baseline value, and then the goals and outcome expectancies are assuming available. The external points are given to bring the person to a target, and then for some reason, once they reach a target and they're in maintenance, they relapse in some way, then you can reconfigure the controller. These are all things that can be done. And then this is sort of again, another vision statement is what we refer to as the perpetual mHealth intervention, where we go from the system ID testing, which involves the multi-sign signals that we showed before, okay, and use that to get a sense of the dynamics of the person, and then be able to commission a controller that takes the person to goal and then is still relevant during maintenance. Okay, and I think, I don't know, there hopefully will have to be some human in the loop in some way, but with not too much intervention. Again, I think the idea of being able to, these systems can be, that would be our goal, is to not require a ton of hand-holding or babysitting. Okay, so to summarize then, just looking at a problem from a dynamical systems perspective, when I showed that smoking data, that right there motivates wanting to use behavioral theories in modeling. The behavioral theories offered a way to have physics into this problem space, and they're good a priori knowledge, and never throw away good a priori knowledge. These are our starting point. I showed mostly linear models. They could be nonlinear if necessary. They could be parameter varying, but we'll start with the simplest thing that works. And lots of opportunities for doing experimental design, improving model estimation, refining behavioral theories, which I think was a theme of Donna's talk and Bonnie's. And then what part of what we want to do as well is incorporate the JEDI. See, the JEDI then would be more of a within-day kind of mechanism that would fit within our overall day-to-day kind of thing. And in fact, we have activities planned in that regard to be able to develop that. And yeah, this work has been funded by agencies, starting with ESSR. I had a K-25 a number of years ago. That was a great 5 years. That came to an end, unfortunately. And then we had funding from Smart and Connected Health for the Just Walk. And this is just, again, I wish I could, it's just a partial list of acknowledgements from local 10-state group and current and former students. So thank you.